When Mr. and Mrs. Brown found a small bear on Paddington Station and decided to take him home and look after him, they had little idea what they were taking on. They called him Paddington. He settled down happily, but because he came from darkest Peru, many of the things he saw were very strange to him, and he had many remarkable adventures. The author, Michael Bond, has written them all down. The adventures you're going to hear now all come from his book, Paddington Helps Out, and they begin with A Picnic on the River.
Paddington sat up in bed with a puzzled expression on his face. Happenings at number 32 Windsor Gardens, particularly breakfast, always followed a strict timetable, and it was most unusual for anything to waken him quite so early. He took a careful look around his room, but everything seemed to be in its place. The photograph of his Aunt Lucy, taken shortly before she entered the Home for Retired Bears in Lima, was on the table beside the bed, along with his jar of special marmalade and several other items. His old hat and duffel coat were both hanging on the door peg, and his Peruvian centavos were under the pillow. And most important of all, when he lifted the bedclothes and peered underneath, his small leather suitcase, with its secret compartment containing his scrapbook and a number of important papers, was still at the bottom of the bed. Paddington heaved a sigh of relief. Although he'd lived with the Browns for over a year, he'd never quite got used to having a room of his own, and he wasn't the sort of bear who believed in taking chances. It was at that point, just as he was absent-mindedly dipping his paw into the marmalade jar before going back to sleep, that Paddington pricked up his ears and listened. There were voices, quite a number of voices, coming from the garden. Several times he heard a door bang, and then, in the distance, he heard a noise remarkably like that of clinking plates, followed by the sound of Mr. Brown shouting orders. Paddington scrambled out of bed and hurried across the room to the window. It sounded most interesting, and he didn't like to think he might be missing anything. As he peered through the glass, he nearly fell over backwards with astonishment at the sight which met his eyes. He breathed heavily on the window-pane and rubbed it with his paw to make sure he wasn't dreaming the whole thing. For there, on the lawn outside, all the Brown family, Mr. and Mrs. Brown, and Jonathan and Judy, were gathered round a large wicker basket. Not only that, but as he watched, Mrs. Bird, their housekeeper, came out of the kitchen carrying a huge plate piled high with sandwiches. Paddington climbed off the windowsill and hurried downstairs. It was all very mysterious, and it definitely needed investigating. "Trust Paddington," said everyone as he came through the kitchen door, just as they were shutting the lid of the hamper. "That bear can smell out a marmalade sandwich a mile away," grumbled Mrs. Bird, the housekeeper. "Honestly," said Judy, waving her finger at him, "it was meant to be a surprise. We got up specially early." Paddington looked from one to the other with growing surprise. "It's all right, Paddington," laughed Mrs. Brown. "There's no need to be alarmed. We're only going for a picnic on the river." "And we're having a competition," cried Jonathan, waving a fishing net in the air. "Dad's promised a prize to whoever makes the first catch." Paddington's eyes grew rounder and rounder. "A picnic?" he exclaimed. "I don't think I've ever been for a picnic on the river before." "Well, that's good," said Mr. Brown, twirling his moustache briskly, "because you're going on one now, so hurry up and eat your breakfast. It's a lovely day. We may as well make the most of it." Paddington needed no second bidding, and while the Browns were busy packing the rest of the picnic gear into the car, he hurried back indoors where his breakfast was waiting. He liked doing new things, and he was looking forward to the day's outing. One of the nicest things about living with the Browns was the number of surprises he had. "I hope I've never, ever done everything, Mrs. Bird," he said, as she came into the dining room to see if he'd finished his toast and marmalade. "I shouldn't have any surprises left then." Replied Mrs. Bird sternly, as she bundled him out of the room. "You'll be getting a surprise if you don't wash those bacon and egg stains off your whiskers before we go out. I've never known such a bear for getting in a mess." Paddington put on his injured expression as he disappeared into the hall. "I was only trying to be quick, Mrs. Bird," he explained. Nevertheless, he hurried upstairs to the bathroom. There were several important things to be done before he went out for the day. First of all, there was his suitcase to be packed, and then he had to consult his atlas. Paddington was very keen on geography, and he was interested in the thought of having a picnic on the river. It sounded most unusual. "I don't know why it is," said Mrs. Bird as she adjusted her hat for what seemed the 40th time, "but whenever this family goes anywhere, it always takes enough to keep a regiment for a month." The Browns were packed into the car, jogging along the road towards the river. Besides the Browns, Mrs. Bird and Paddington, there was the hamper, a gramophone, a pile of records, a number of parcels, and some fishing nets, not to mention several sunshades, a tent, and a pile of cushions. Mrs. Brown shifted uncomfortably as she agreed with Mrs. Bird. Paddington's leather suitcase was sticking in her back, and his old hat, which he insisted on wearing in case of sunstroke, kept tickling the side of her face. "Is it much farther?" she asked. Paddington, who was sitting beside her on the front seat, consulted his map. "I think it's the next turning on the right," he announced, following the route with his paw. "I hope so," said Mrs. Brown. They'd already taken one wrong turning when Paddington had followed a piece of dried marmalade peel on his map by mistake. "Fancy turning right at a piece of dried marmalade peel," grumbled Mr. Brown. "That policeman didn't like it at all." Anxious to make amends, Paddington stuck his head out of the window and sniffed. "I think we must be getting near, Mr. Brown," he called. "I can smell something unusual." "That's the gasworks," said Mr. Brown, following the direction of Paddington's paw. "The river's on this side." Just as he spoke, they swept round a corner, and there, straight in front of them, was a broad expanse of water. Paddington's eyes lit up as they all clambered out of the car, and while the others were unloading the supplies, he stood on the water's edge and surveyed the scene. He was most impressed. The towpath was crowded with people, and there were boats everywhere. Rowing boats, canoes, punts, sailing boats with their white sails billowing in the wind. As he watched, a steamer packed with more people swept by, sending a large wave shooting across the water and causing all the smaller boats to rock. Everyone on board seemed very gay and happy, and several of them pointed towards Paddington and waved. Paddington raised his hat in reply and then turned to the others. "I think I'm going to like the river," he announced. I do hope so, dear," said Mrs. Brown uneasily. "It is your treat." Mrs. Brown looked at the row of boats moored by the landing stage. The day before, it had seemed a very good idea of Mr. Brown's to have a picnic on the river, but now they were actually here. She had a nasty feeling in the back of her mind, and she knew Mrs. Bird was feeling the same way. Close to, the boats looked awfully small. "Are you sure they're safe, Henry?" she asked, looking at them nervously. "Safe?" echoed Mr. Brown as he led the way onto the landing stage. "Of course they're safe, Mary. You just leave everything to me." "I'll put you in charge of all the ropes and things, Paddington," he called. "That means you can steer." "Thank you very much, Mr. Brown," said Paddington, feeling most important. His eyes gleamed with excitement as he climbed into the boat and carefully examined everything with his paws. "The boatman's rather busy," said Mr. Brown as he helped the others in, "so I said we'd shove off by ourselves." "Paddington!" exclaimed Mrs. Brown, as she picked Mrs. Bird's best sun hat off the floor of the boat. "Do mind what you're doing with the fishing net. You'll have someone's head off." "I'm sorry, Mrs. Bird," said Paddington. "I was only testing it." "Yeah, all right," said Mr. Brown, as he settled himself on his seat, took a firm grip on the oars. "Here we go. Stand by at the helm, Paddington." Do what, Mr. Brown?" cried Paddington.
"Pull on the ropes," shouted Mr. Brown. "Come on. Left paw down."
"Oh, dear," said Mrs. Bird nervously, as she clutched the side of the boat with one hand and gripped her sunshade with the other. Out of the corner of her eye she could already see a number of people staring in their direction. In the back of the boat, Paddington pulled hard on the 2 ropes tied to the rudder. He wasn't quite sure whether Mr. Brown had meant his, Mr. Brown's, or his own left, so he pulled both, just to make certain. Everyone waited expectantly, while Mr. Brown strained on the oars. "I should have thought, Henry," said Mrs. Brown, after a few moments had gone by, "I should have thought it would have been much easier if you'd untied the boat from the landing stage first." "What?" exclaimed Mr. Brown. He mopped his brow and looked crossly over his shoulder. "Hasn't anyone done that yet?" "I'll do it, Mr. Brown," called Paddington importantly, as he clambered along the side of the boat. "I'm in charge of ropes." The Browns waited patiently, while Paddington examined the rope. He wasn't very good at knots because they were rather difficult with paws, but eventually he announced that all was ready. "Right!" shouted Mr. Brown, as he braced himself once more. "Here we go! Cast off, Paddington! Hold on, everyone!" "Do what, Mr. Brown?" cried Paddington above the splashing of the water. Having a picnic on the river was much more complicated than he'd expected. There were so many ropes to pull, he was getting a bit confused. First of all, Mr. Brown had told him to untie the rope, and now he'd shouted to everyone to hold on. Paddington closed his eyes and held onto the rope with both paws as tightly as he could. He wasn't quite sure what happened next. One moment he was standing on the boat, and the next moment it wasn't there anymore. "Henry!" shouted Mrs. Brown as there was a loud splash. "For goodness sake, Paddington's fallen in the water!" "Bear overboard!" cried Jonathan, as the boat shot away from the bank. "Hold on, Paddington!" called Judy. "We're coming!" But I did hold on," cried Paddington, as he came up, spluttering for air. "That's how I fell in." Mrs. Brown lunged into the water with her sunshade. "Do hurry, Henry," she cried. "I'm sure Paddington can't swim," said Judy. "What did you say?" called Paddington. "She said you can't swim," yelled Mr. Brown. When he heard what Mr. Brown had said, Paddington began waving his paws wildly in the air, and there was a gurgle as he promptly sank. "There now, Henry," exclaimed Mrs. Brown. "Now look what you've done. He was all right until you spoke." "Well, I like that," said Mr. Brown, giving his wife an expressive look. "It's all right," shouted Jonathan. "Someone's thrown him a lifebelt." By the time the Browns reached the landing stage, Paddington had already been rescued, and he was lying on his back, surrounded by a large crowd. Everyone was staring down at him, making suggestions, while the man in charge of the boats pulled his paws back and forth, giving him artificial respiration. "Thank goodness he's safe," exclaimed Mrs. Brown thankfully.
"Don't see why he shouldn't be," said the man. "If he'd laid himself down, it'd only come up to his whiskers. The water's only about 9 inches deep just here. Probably a lot less now, judging by the amount he's swallowed. Kept his mouth open when he went under, I dare say."
Judy bent down and looked at Paddington. "I think he's trying to say something," she said. Said Paddington as he sat up.
"Now, you just lay still for a moment, young fella, me bear," said the boatman, pushing Paddington back down again. Said Paddington. "I think I lost the hat."
"What do you say?" asked the man.
"Are you one of them foreign bears?"
"Yeah, we get a rare lot of overseas visitors this time of the year," he said, turning to the Browns. "I come from Peru," spluttered Paddington as he got his breath back. "But I live at number 32 Windsor Gardens in London. And I think I've lost my hat. Oh, dear, said Mrs. Brown, clutching her husband's arm. Did you hear that, Henry? Paddington's lost his hat. The Brown family stared at each other in dismay. They often grumbled about Paddington's hat, usually when he wasn't listening, because it was so old. People had a habit of pointing at it when they were out, and it made them feel embarrassed. But all the same, they couldn't even begin to picture Paddington without it. I had it on when I fell in the water, cried Paddington, feeling on top of his head, and now it isn't there anymore. Gosh, said Jonathan, it had so many holes in it too. Perhaps it's sunk. Sunk, cried Paddington in dismay. He ran to the edge of the landing stage and peered at the muddy water. But it can't have sunk. He's always worn it, explained Mrs. Brown to the boatman, ever since we've known him. It was given to him by his uncle in Peru. Darkest Peru, said Paddington. Darkest Peru, repeated the boatman, looking most impressed. He turned to Paddington and touched his forelock. You'll be wanting the Thames Conservancy, sir. No, I don't, said Paddington firmly. I want my hat. He means they look after the river, dear, explained Mrs. Brown. They may have found it for you. It's the current, sir, explained the boatman. Once you get away from the bank, it's very strong, and it may have got swept over the weir. He pointed along the river towards a row of buildings in the distance. Got swept over the weir? Repeated Paddington slowly. The boatman nodded. If it ain't already been sucked into a whirlpool. Paddington gave the man a hard stare. My hat, he exclaimed, hardly able to believe his ears. My hat got sucked into a whirlpool? Now, come along, said Mr. Brown hastily. If we hurry, we may be just in time to see it go over. Closely followed by Mr. and Mrs. Brown, Mrs. Bird, Jonathan and Judy, the boatman, and a crowd of interested sightseers, Paddington hurried along the towpath with a grim expression on his face, leaving a trail of water behind him. By the time they reached the weir, the news had already spread, and several men in peaked caps were peering anxiously into the water. I hear you've lost a very valuable Persian cat, said the lockkeeper to Mr. Brown. No, not a cat, said Mr. Brown, a hat, and it's from Peru. It belongs to this young bear, gentleman Fred, explained the boatman as he joined them. It's a family heirloom. A family heirloom, repeated the lockkeeper, scratching his head as he looked at Paddington. I've never heard of a hat being a family heirloom before, especially a bear's heirloom. Mine is, said Paddington firmly. It's a very rare sort of hat, and it's got a marmalade sandwich inside. I put it there in case of an emergency. A marmalade sandwich, said the lockkeeper, looking more and more surprised. Now, wait a minute. It wouldn't be that thing we fished out just now, would it? All sort of shapeless, like a, like a... He tried hard to think of words to describe it. Well, that sounds like it, said Mrs. Bird. Herbert, called the man to a boy who was standing nearby watching the proceedings with an open mouth. See if we've still got that, what's-her-name, in the shed. It might well be an heirloom, he continued, turning to the Browns. It looks as if it's been handed down a lot. Everyone waited anxiously while Herbert disappeared into a small hut by the side of the lock. He returned after a few moments, carrying a bucket. We put it in here, said the lockkeeper apologetically, because we'd never seen anything like it before. We were going to send it to the museum. Paddington peered into the bucket. That's not a was name, he exclaimed thankfully. That's my hat. Everyone breathed a sigh of relief. Oh, thank goodness, said Mrs. Bird, echoing all their thoughts. There's a fish inside it as well, said the lockkeeper. What? Exclaimed Paddington. A fish? Inside my hat? Oh, that's right, said the man. It must have been after your marmalade sandwich. Probably got in through one of the holes." "Crikey!" exclaimed Jonathan admiringly, as the Browns gathered round the bucket. "So there is!" "That means Paddington's won the prize for catching the first fish," said Judy. "Congratulations." "Well, if it's some kind of competition," said the lockkeeper, "I'd better get you a jam jar to put it in, sir." "I suppose," he said, looking rather doubtfully at the hat, "I suppose you'll be wanting to wear it again?" As Paddington gave him a hard stare, he backed away and hurried off in search of a jam jar. "There you are," he said, when he returned, "with the compliments of the Thames Conservancy." "Thank you very much," said Paddington gratefully, offering the man his paw. "Not at all," said the man, as he stood by the side of the lock to wave them goodbye. "It's a pleasure. After all, it's not every day we have the opportunity of saving a bear's heirloom from going over the weir. I shall remember today for a long time to come." "And so shall I remember it," said Mr. Brown, as he stopped rowing some while later and let the boat drift lazily downstream in the current. "It may not have been the quietest day we've ever spent on the river, but it's certainly the nicest." And the Brown family, Mrs. Bird, and Paddington, as they lay back in the boat, watching the shimmering water and listening to the music from the gramophone, had to agree. Paddington's friend, Mr. Gruber, laughed no end when he heard all about the trip on the river. Oh, dear Mr. Brown," he said, wiping the tears from his eyes. "Things do happen to you. I wish I could have been there to see it all." It was the morning after the picnic, and Paddington had hurried round as soon as possible to tell Mr. Gruber all about it. Mr. Gruber kept an antique shop in the Portobello Road. It was near the Browns' house, and Paddington usually called in when he was doing the morning shopping, so that they could share a bun and a cup of cocoa for their 11s. Most of the shops in the Portobello Road were interesting, but Mr. Gruber's was the best of all. It was like going into Aladdin's cave. There were swords and old suits of armour hanging on the walls, gleaming copper and brass pots and pans stacked on the floor, pictures, china ornaments, pieces of furniture and pottery piled up to the ceiling. In fact, there was very little, one way and another, that Mr. Gruber didn't sell, and people came from far and wide to seek his advice. Mr. Gruber also kept a huge library of second-hand books in the back of his shop, which he let Paddington consult whenever any problems cropped up. Paddington found this most useful, as the public library didn't have a bears department, and the assistants usually looked at him suspiciously when he peered through the window at them. After Paddington had explained to Mr. Gruber all about his trip on the river, they fell silent for a moment while they ate their buns and drank their cocoa. It was while he was sitting back in his deck chair, admiring the view and watching the passers-by, that Paddington noticed Mr. Gruber's shop window for the first time that morning. To his surprise, it looked unusually empty. "Ah," said Mr. Gruber, following his glance, "I had a very busy day yesterday, Mr. Brown. While you were having high jinks on the river, a big party of American visitors came round, and they bought all kinds of things. As a matter of fact," he continued, "I did so well, I have to go to an auction sale this afternoon to pick up some more antiques." "An auction sale?" said Paddington, looking most interested. "What does it look like, Mr. Gruber?" Mr. Gruber thought for a moment. "Well," he began, "it's a place where they sell things to the highest bidder, Mr. Brown, all kinds of things, but it's very difficult to explain without actually showing you." Mr. Gruber rubbed his glasses and coughed. I suppose, Mr. Brown, it wouldn't be possible for you to come along with me this afternoon, would it? And then you could see for yourself." "Oh, yes, please, Mr. Gruber," exclaimed Paddington, his eyes gleaming with excitement at the thought. "I should like that very much indeed." Paddington felt very excited as he entered the auction rooms. Mr. Gruber had put on his best suit for the occasion, and a number of people turned to stare at them as they came through the door. Having bought 2 catalogues, Mr. Gruber pushed his way to the front so that Paddington would have a good view. On the way, he introduced him to several of the other dealers as Mr. Brown, a young bear friend of mine from darkest Peru, who is interested in antiques. They all shook Paddington's paw and whispered that they were very pleased to meet him. It was all much different to what Paddington had expected. It was really like a very big antique shop with boxes and tables loaded with china and silver all round the walls. There was a large crowd of people standing in the middle of the room, facing a man on a platform who appeared to be waving a hammer in the air. "That's the auctioneer," whispered Mr. Gruber. "He's the man you want to watch. He's most important." Paddington raised his hat politely to the auctioneer and then settled down his suitcase and carefully looked around. After a moment, he decided he liked auction sales. Everyone seemed so friendly. In fact, he'd hardly made himself comfortable before a man on the other side of the room waved his hand in their direction. Paddington stood up, raised his hat, and waved a friendly paw back. No sooner had he sat down than the man waved again. Well, being a polite bear, Paddington stood up and once more waved his paw. To his surprise, the man stopped waving almost immediately and glared at him instead. Paddington gave him a hard stare and then settled down to watch the man on the platform, who appeared to be doing something with his hammer again. "Going!" the man shouted, hitting his table. "Going!" "Gone. Sold to the young bear gentleman in the hat for £2.50. "Oh, dear," said Mr. Gruber, looking most upset. "I'm afraid you've just bought a set of carpentry tools, Mr. Brown." "What?" repeated Paddington, nearly falling off his suitcase with surprise. "I've bought a set of carpentry tools?" "Come along," said the auctioneer sternly. "You're holding up the proceedings. Pay at the desk, please." "A set of carpentry tools?" exclaimed Paddington, jumping up and waving his paws in the air. "But I didn't even say anything." Mr. Gruber looked most embarrassed. "I'm afraid it's all my fault, Mr. Brown," he said. "I should have explained auction sales to you before we came in. I think perhaps I'd better pay for them, as it wasn't really your fault." "You see," Mr. Gruber said when he returned from the desk, "you see, you have to be very careful at a sale, Mr. Brown." Mr. Gruber went on to explain how the auctioneer offered each item for sale, and how, after one person had made a bid for something, it was up to anyone else who wanted it to make a better offer. "If you nod your head, Mr. Brown," he said, or even scratch your nose, they think it's a sign you want to buy something. I expect the auctioneer saw you raise your hat now and thought you were bidding." Paddington wasn't at all sure what Mr. Gruber meant, but having carefully made sure the auctioneer wasn't looking, he quickly nodded and then sat very still while he watched the proceedings. Although he didn't say anything to Mr. Gruber, he was beginning to wish he hadn't come to the auction. The room was hot and crowded, and he wanted to take his hat off. Apart from that, he was sitting on the handle of his suitcase, which was most uncomfortable. He closed his eyes and was just about to try and go to sleep when Mr. Gruber nudged his paw and pointed to the catalogue. "I say, Mr. Brown," he said, "the next item is very interesting. It's an old pistol, the sort highwaymen use. They're quite popular now. I think I shall try bidding for it. Paddington sat up and watched excitedly as the auctioneer held the pistol in the air for everyone to see. "Lot 34, he shouted. "Now what am I bid for this genuine antique pistol?" £4, came a voice from the back of the room. £4.50, called Mr. Gruber, waving his catalogue. £5, came another voice. "Oh, dear," said Mr. Gruber, making some calculations on the side of his catalogue. £5.50. £6, came the same voice again. Paddington stood on his case and stared across the room. "That's the man who made me buy the carpentry tools by mistake," he whispered, tapping Mr. Gruber excitedly. "Well, we mustn't let him have it, whatever we do," explained Mr. Gruber. £6.50. £7, cried Paddington wildly. Said Mr. Gruber, tactfully, not wishing to offend Paddington. "I think we are bidding against each other, Mr. Brown." "Any advance on £7, shouted the auctioneer, looking most pleased. As there was no reply, he raised his hammer. "Going! Going!" he called. "Gone!" He brought the hammer down with a loud crash. "Sold to the young bear gentleman in the front row for £7. Mr. Gruber felt in his wallet for the money. Taking Paddington to an auction sale was becoming rather expensive. "I'm sorry about that, Mr. Gruber," said Paddington guiltily when he returned. "I'm afraid I got rather excited." "Oh, that's all right," said Mr. Gruber. "It was still a very good bargain, Mr. Brown, and I did want it. I shall put it in my window tomorrow." "I think perhaps I'd better not do any more bidding," said Paddington, looking very crestfallen. "I don't think bears are very good at it." "Nonsense," said Mr. Gruber. "You've been doing very well for a first time." All the same, Paddington decided to keep quiet for a while and watch Mr. Gruber. It was all very complicated, and not a bit like shopping in the market, where he was allowed to test everything with his paws first before arguing over the price. Mr. Gruber pointed out several items in the catalogue to Paddington and gave him a pencil so that he could mark off the ones he had bought and how much had been paid for them. The list of items Mr. Gruber bought grew and grew until Paddington felt quite dizzy with writing down all the figures, and he was pleased when at last he announced that he'd finished buying for the day. "A very good day's work indeed, Mr. Brown," he said, as he checked Paddington's figures, "and thank you very much for all your help. I don't know what I would have done without you." Paddington looked up from his own catalogue, which he'd been studying earnestly. "That's all right, Mr. Gruber," he said, vaguely. "Excuse me, but what is a preserves stand?" "A preserve stand," said Mr. Gruber. "Well, it's a thing for holding jam or marmalade." Paddington's eyes gleamed as he started to unlock his suitcase. "I think I shall bid for that, Mr. Gruber," he said excitedly, as he peered inside the secret compartment to see how much money he had. "It's the next item in the catalogue. I think I should like a preserve stand for my marmalade." Mr. Gruber looked at him rather nervously. "I should be careful if I were you, Mr. Brown," he said. "It may be an antique one. If it is, it's probably worth a lot of money." But before he had time to explain to Paddington just how much it might cost him, the auctioneer rapped on his table for silence. "Lot 99, he shouted, as he held up a piece of shining silver to the light. "A very unusual kind of preserve stand. What am I bid for this valuable piece of antique silver?" 5p, cried Paddington. A hush fell over the room. 5p? Echoed the auctioneer, hardly able to believe his ears. "Did I hear someone say 5p? "I did," called Paddington, waving his catalogue in the air. "I wanted to keep my marmalade in. Mrs. Bird's always grumbling because my jars get sticky." "Your jars get sticky?" repeated the auctioneer, passing a hand over his forehead. It really was a most unusual day. Things hadn't gone at all according to plan. Some items had been sold for far more than he'd expected, and others, like this preserve stand, were fetching nothing at all. He had a nasty feeling it had something to do with the young bear in the front row. He seemed to have a very powerful stare, and he'd done his best up to now to avoid catching Paddington's eye. Come. Come, he said, giving a high-pitched laugh. I'm sure we all enjoy a little joke. Yes, well, let's start again. Now, what am I bid for this valuable item? 8p, said a voice at the back of the hall amid laughter. 10p, said Paddington firmly. The laughter died down, and there was silence. If you ask me, whispered a voice behind Paddington, that young bear knows something. Well, it's probably a fake, whispered another voice. After all, it's not the first thing he's bought this afternoon. He's with old Gruber, too, whispered the first voice. And he said he was interested in antiques when he came in. I wouldn't touch it if I were you. The auctioneer shuddered as he gazed at the preserve stand in his hand. Any advance on 10p, he cried. There was another long silence. Going, he shouted, raising his hammer, looking around hopefully. Going! Still no one spoke. Gone! He brought his hammer down on the desk with a crash. Sold to the young bear gentleman in the front row for 10p. Thank you very much, said Paddington as he hurried up to the table. I hope you don't mind if I pay you in half-p pieces, but I've been saving up in case of an emergency. Half-p pieces? Said the man. He mopped his brow with a spotted handkerchief. I don't know, he said, turning to his assistant. I must be getting old, letting young bears get the better of me at my time of life. A very good bargain indeed, said Mr. Gruber admiringly when they were outside the sale room. He turned Paddington's preserve stand over in his hands. I should say it's worth every penny of £5. £5? Exclaimed Paddington, staring at Mr. Gruber. £5 for a marmalade stand? Oh, at least that, said Mr. Gruber. I'll put it in my window for you if you like, Mr. Brown. Paddington thought hard for a moment. I think I would like you to have it as a present, Mr. Gruber, he said at last. I don't expect you to have bought the carpentry tools if I hadn't been at the auction sale. Mr. Gruber looked most affected by Paddington's offer. Well, that's very kind of you, Mr. Brown, he said. Very kind of you indeed, but I know how fond you are of marmalade, and I'd much rather you had it. Besides, he added, I've had a very good day, and I think it was worth the price of the carpentry tools just to see the expression on the auctioneer's face when you offered him 5p for the preserve stand. Mr. Gruber chuckled at the thought. I don't think he's had many dealings with young bears before. I'm afraid, said the lady in the cash desk at the Podium Super Cinema, I'm afraid you can't come in. It's an A film. I beg your pardon, said Paddington, looking puzzled. A, said the lady. A? Repeated Paddington, looking puzzled. Not A, said the lady impatiently. A. That means bears under 16 aren't allowed in unaccompanied. 16? Exclaimed Paddington, hardly able to believe his ears. 16? But I'm only 2. That's another 14 years. I might not even want to come then. Well, that's the law, said the lady sternly. She looked down with some distaste at the top of Paddington's hat. It still had 1 or 2 pieces of riverweed sticking to it, and the warmth of the cinema was bringing out the smell. "Now come along, please," she said hastily. "You're holding up the queue. And no coming back later on wearing long trousers," she called out, as Paddington turned to go. "I know all the tricks." Paddington had never been to the pictures before. In fact, he wasn't at all sure what they were. But he enjoyed anything new, and for some weeks he'd been saving hard out of the 10p a week bun money Mr. Brown gave him in case an interesting programme came along. Paddington was a bear who liked getting his money's worth, and he'd carefully studied the advertisements outside the podium until this week, when there was a super double feature programme showing, with 2 long films, a cartoon, and a newsreel. Not only that, but a notice outside said there was a special added attraction that evening when Reginald Clove would be playing the theatre organ during the intervals. "Do you mean to say you've never been to the pictures, Paddington?" said Mr. Brown over tea that afternoon. "Never," said Paddington firmly, as he helped himself to a crumpet. "And now I can't go for another 14 years unless I'm accompanied." Mr. Brown looked at his wife. "It's a long time since we all went to the pictures, Mary," he said. "And it's still quite early. Shall we go?" "Gosh, Dad, let's!" exclaimed Jonathan and Judy together. "Do you think it's a good programme, Paddington?" asked Mrs. Brown. "Oh, very good, Mrs. Brown," said Paddington knowledgeably. "And there's a man playing the organ. It's a special attraction. So I think it's a very good bargain, Mr. Brown." "Well, that settles it," said Mr. Brown, looking at his watch. "It all sounds much too good to miss." Immediately, the whole house was in an uproar. Paddington was sent upstairs by Mrs. Bird to wash the crumpet stains off his whiskers, while the rest of the family hurried off to their respective rooms to change. Paddington felt very superior some half an hour later, when they all trooped into the podium cinema. He raised his hat to the doorkeeper, and then led Mr. Brown in the direction of the cash desk. "I am accompanied now," he called out to the lady in charge. The lady stared at Mr. Brown. "I beg your pardon?" she exclaimed, and she sniffed and gave him a very strange look. It was most odd, but she could distinctly smell fish again. "What did you say?" she repeated. "Nothing," said Mr. Brown hastily. Well, I'd like 3 3/2 for the front row of the circle, please." They went up, and Paddington soon lost count of the number of steps. In fact, there were so many, he almost wished they'd gone downstairs instead. Not only that, but as he followed the Browns through the entrance to the circle, he discovered it was all dark inside. "This way, please," said the usherette, as she led the way down some stairs and shone the torch along a row of seats in the front row. "Yes, you're lucky. There's just 6 left together." "Thank you very much," said Mrs. Brown as she made her way along the row. "Excuse me, please. Excuse me. Thank you very much." She sat down and arranged herself comfortably as the others joined her. "That's a bit of luck," whispered Mr. Brown, "finding 6 together." He looked along the row. "Where's Paddington?" "Paddington?" exclaimed Mrs. Brown. "Isn't he with you, Henry?" "No," replied Mr. Brown. "I thought you had him." "Oh, crumbs," groaned Judy. "Trust Paddington to get lost." "Where on earth can he have got to?" grumbled Mr. Brown as he struck a match and began looking under the seats. "Here I am, Mr. Brown," called Paddington from the end of the row. "I went all the way along by mistake." "Shh!" said a nasty-sounding voice from the row behind. "It's all dark and I can't see," exclaimed Paddington as he was passed back along the row. "Are you all right now, dear?" whispered Mrs. Brown as Paddington sat down beside her. "I think so," said Paddington, peering at the screen. "Oi!" said the nasty voice from behind again. "Oi!" How about taking your titfer off? Paddington turned and stared in the direction of the speaker. My titfer? He exclaimed. Take my titfer off? That's right, said the voice. Your tit for tat. I think he means your hat, dear, explained Mrs. Brown. It's probably getting in the way of the screen. Paddington thought for a moment. He wasn't at all keen on taking his hat off in case it got lost in the dark. I'll turn it round, if you like, he said generously. Then you can look through one of the holes. Paddington gave his attention to the screen. It was all very interesting, with people dashing about all over the place and with music that got louder and louder, but Paddington found it difficult to understand what it was all about. And to his surprise, after only a few minutes, the music suddenly ended and all the lights in the cinema came on. Well, he exclaimed, looking most disappointed, I didn't think much of that. It's all right, Paddington, explained Judy. That's what's showing next week. That was only the trailer. But her words fell on empty ears, for Paddington was staring at the screen again and licking his whiskers. Oh, dear, groaned Mr. Brown, as he followed Paddington's gaze. They would have to advertise ice cream. They must have known he was coming. He felt in his pocket. You'd better get 6 tubs and some nougat or something for the big picture, Jonathan. I think I'm going to enjoy myself, announced Paddington, a few moments later as Mr. Brown handed him the refreshments. He dipped his spoon into the ice cream tub and stared excitedly at the screen as the lights went down again to herald the start of the cowboy film. Paddington enjoyed the cowboy film much more than the trailer, and he soon became quite lost in the story. He stood up on his seat with his paws on the balcony and his eyes glued on the screen. Every now and then, he automatically dipped his spoon into the ice cream tub, and several times a lump fell off the spoon before it had even reached his mouth, which was most unusual. It was all very complicated at first. Everyone seemed to be shooting at everyone else, and Paddington got worried in case there was no one left and they had to stop the film. Each time the villain, who wore a black mask and a black hat, came onto the screen, he booed. And when the hero appeared, riding a white horse, he cheered and waved his hat in the air until Mrs. Brown became quite embarrassed. She wasn't at all sorry when at long last the hero rode off into the setting sun and the film came to an end. Most enjoyable, said Mrs. Bird, rather surprisingly. The Browns had somehow never thought of Mrs. Bird liking cowboy films. Did you like it, Paddington? Paddington nodded his head vigorously. I enjoyed it very much, thank you, Mrs. Bird, he said. Except I can't find my nougat anywhere. Never mind, Paddington, said Mr. Brown, after they'd all searched in vain for it. I'll buy you some more in a minute, after we've heard the organ. He sat back heavily in his seat and then turned to Paddington. If you watch, he explained, you'll see it come up through the floor in a moment. Come up through the floor, Mr. Brown? Exclaimed Paddington. I don't think I've ever seen an organ come up through the floor before. Oh, dear, said Mrs. Bird, and it doesn't look as if you're going to now. Look! She pointed to the screen, where an announcement had just been flashed on to say that Mr. Reginald Clove was indisposed. What? Cried Paddington hotly as the words sank in. Reginald Clove? Indisposed? That means he's ill, dear, explained Mrs. Brown, so he won't be playing after all. Oh, how very disappointing, said Mr. Brown. It's a long time since I heard an organ. I was really looking forward to it. While the rest of the Browns watched the advertisements on the screen, Paddington sank back into his seat and listened to Mr. Brown explaining what the organ would have looked like had it come up through the floor. Mr. Brown liked organs and went on for a long time about it. Henry, said Mrs. Brown when he'd finished, where's Paddington? Paddington? Exclaimed Mr. Brown. Oh, don't tell me he's disappeared again. He was here a moment ago. But Paddington was already almost out of sight. He was hurrying up the aisle and out through the door marked exit. There was a purposeful expression on his face, one which the Browns would have recognised at once had they been able to see him. Paddington wasn't the only one with a purposeful expression on his face at that moment. As he hurried down the stairs on one side of the cinema, the manager of the podium strode up the stairs leading to the projection box on the other. There was something unusual going on in his theatre, and he intended finding out what it was. He prided himself that the podium was normally a very well-run cinema, but on this particular evening things had gone wrong from the beginning. First of all, the lady in the cash desk, usually a most reliable person, had complained of a fishy smell and mysterious voices saying they were accompanied, coming from underneath her counter. And then Reginald Clove had announced the fact that he couldn't play the organ. And if that wasn't enough, there'd come news of goings-on in the circle. Well, occasionally he had a spot of bother in the cheaper seats downstairs, but never in the circle. There had been complaints of Bear's booze coming from the front row during the cowboy film. And as he passed through the stalls, he'd also noticed several people immediately underneath the balcony with ice cream stains on their hats. It was all very disturbing, and he wasn't in the best of moods as he burst into the projection room waving a piece of paper. "I want this notice flashed on the screen," he said crossly. "At once." "Good heavens!" exclaimed Mrs. Brown a few moments later. "What on earth can that mean?" Mr. Brown adjusted his glasses and stared at the screen. "Will the owner of the young bear in the circle kindly report to the manager's office immediately," he read. "I don't know, Mary," he said as he made to get to his feet, "but I'm certainly going to find out." "Owner, indeed," snorted Mrs. Bird, "as if anyone owned Paddington." "The boot's on the other paw, if you ask me," began Mr. Brown. "Paddington owns us." As he was speaking, a strange expression came over his face. "Well, Henry," said Mrs. Brown, staring at her husband, "aren't you going to do something about it?" I can't get up," exclaimed Mr. Brown, feeling his seat. "I seem to be stuck to something." "Nougat," he said bitterly. "Paddington's nougat. No wonder the manager wants to see me in his office." Mr. Reginald Clove looked quite startled when Paddington came through the door. He'd been expecting someone to come, but he certainly hadn't expected it to be a bear. "Are you from the first aid?" he asked, looking at Paddington rather doubtfully. "Oh, no," said Paddington, politely raising his hat. "I'm from number 32 Windsor Gardens, and I've come about the organ." Mr. Clove stepped back a pace. You've come about the organ?" he repeated, trying to humour Paddington. "Yes," said Paddington. "I wanted to see it come up through the floor." "Oh!" Mr. Clove's face cleared. "Oh, is that all?" "All?" exclaimed Paddington hotly. "It's very important. Mr. Brown was looking forward to it." "Oh, dear," said Mr. Clove, idly sorting through a pile of music with one hand. "I'm so sorry. I wish I could oblige, but I've hurt my hand, you see, and I've no one to turn the music for me, and—" He looked thoughtfully at Paddington. "Do you like music, Bear?" he asked suddenly. "Oh, yes," replied Paddington, "but I don't really play anything except the comb and paper, and I'm not very good at that because I get my whiskers caught in the comb." "Do you think you could turn the music for me?" asked Mr. Clove. "Well," said Paddington doubtfully, "it's a bit difficult for bears because of their paws, but if you could tell me when to do it, I could try." Mr. Clove came to a decision. "You'll do," he said briskly. "Come with me." "Goings on!" exclaimed Mrs. Bird, waving her handbag at the manager. "They weren't goings on. He was only enjoying himself." "Bear's booze," said the manager sternly, "in the podium circle, and nougat on one of my best seats." "Then you shouldn't sell it," replied Mrs. Bird. "It's asking for trouble." "Well, where is he now?" demanded the manager. "Tell me that. I want to start the big picture. We're 5 minutes late already." The Browns exchanged anxious glances. Knowing Paddington, he might be anywhere. But before they had time to reply, they were all startled into silence by a loud rumbling from the front of the cinema, which grew and grew in volume until the whole place began to shake. "Good heavens!" exclaimed the manager, as a burst of applause swept through the audience. "It's Reginald Clove playing Rule Britannia, and with one hand, too." They all stared over the balcony as the lights dimmed, and the organ rose into view, bathed in a pink spotlight. "Mercy me!" cried Mrs. Bird, clutching her seat. "And there's that bear! What on earth is he doing now?" Paddington felt most important as he rode up on the organ, and he wished he could turn and wave to the Browns to let them know where he was, but he was much too busy carrying out Mr. Clove's instructions. The audience applauded all the items, and Paddington felt quite sorry when Mr. Clove at last pressed a button by his side and the organ began to sink back through the floor. But as it finally disappeared from view and the last notes of the music died away, a loud cheer went up from the audience, and several voices were heard shouting for more. Afterwards, everyone agreed that, good though the big picture was, the organ had been the high spot of the evening. Even the manager of the podium seemed very pleased, and he took the Browns on a tour behind the scenes before they left. "I don't suppose," said Paddington thoughtfully as they made their way home, "I don't suppose there are many bears who've been for a ride on an organ, especially one that comes up through the floor. And I don't suppose," said Mr. Brown, as he turned and looked hard at Paddington, "that there are many people who've been stuck to their seats by a piece of bear's nougat." But Paddington had his eyes closed. He wasn't exactly asleep, but he had a lot of things to write in his scrapbook that night when he went to bed. He'd enjoyed his visit to the pictures, and it needed a lot of careful thought to put it all into words. "I vote," said Mr. Brown, "that we celebrate the occasion by visiting a restaurant. All those in favour say aye." Mr. Brown's suggestion had a mixed reception. Jonathan and Judy called out aye at once. Mrs. Brown looked rather doubtful, and Mrs. Bird kept her eyes firmly on her knitting. "Do you think it wise, Henry?" said Mrs. Brown. "You know what Paddington's like when we take him out. Things happen." "It is his birthday," replied Mr. Brown. "And his anniversary," said Judy. "Well, sort of." The Browns were holding a council of war. It was Paddington's summer birthday. Being a bear, Paddington had 2 birthdays every year, one at Christmas and the other in midsummer. That apart, he had now been with the Browns for a little over a year, and it had been decided to celebrate the 2 occasions at the same time. "After all, we ought to do something," said Mr. Brown, playing his trump card. "If we hadn't seen him that day on Paddington Station, we might never have met him, and goodness knows where he would have ended up." The Browns were silent for a moment, as they considered the awful possibility of never having met Paddington. "I must say," remarked Mrs. Bird in a voice which really decided the matter, "I must say the house wouldn't be the same without him." "That settles it," said Mr. Brown. "I'll ring the Porchester right away and reserve a table for tonight." "Oh, Henry," exclaimed Mrs. Brown, "not the Porchester. That's such an expensive place." Mr. Brown waved his hand in the air. "Nothing but the best is good enough for Paddington," he said generously. "We'll invite Mr. Gruber as well, and make a real party of it." Paddington became more and more excited on the journey to the restaurant. He always enjoyed seeing the lights of London, and even though it was summer, quite a few of them had already come on by the time they got there. He followed Mr. Brown up the steps of the restaurant and in through some large doors, giving the man who held them open a friendly wave of his paw. In the distance there was the sound of music, and as they all gathered inside the entrance in order to leave their coats at the cloakroom, Paddington looked around with interest at the chandeliers hanging from the ceiling and the dozens of waiters gliding to and fro. "Here comes the head waiter," said Mr. Brown, as a tall, superior-looking man approached. "We've booked a table near the orchestra," he called, "in the name of Brown." The head waiter stared at Paddington. "Is the young Bear gentleman with you?" he asked, looking down his nose. "With us?" said Mr. Brown. "We're with him. It's his party." "Oh," said the man, disapprovingly. "Then I'm afraid you can't come in." "What?" exclaimed Paddington amid a chorus of dismay. "But I went without a second helping at lunch specially." "I'm afraid this young gentleman isn't wearing evening dress," explained the man. "Everyone at the Porchester has to wear evening dress." Paddington could hardly believe his ears, and he gave the man a hard stare. "Bears don't have evening dress," said Judy, squeezing his paw. "They have evening fur, and Paddington's has been washed specially." The head waiter looked at Paddington doubtfully. Paddington had a very persistent stare when he liked, and some of the special ones his Aunt Lucy had taught him were very powerful indeed. The man coughed. "Well, I dare say," he said, "I dare say we might make an exception, just this once." He turned and led the way through the crowded restaurant, past tables covered with snowy white cloths and gleaming silver, towards a big round table near the orchestra. Paddington followed on close behind, and by the time they reached it, the man's neck had gone a funny shade of red. When they were all seated, the head waiter gave them each a huge card on which was printed a list of all the dishes. Paddington had to hold his with both paws, and he stared at it in amazement. "Well, Paddington," said Mr. Brown, "what would you like to start with? Soup, hors d'oeuvre?" Paddington looked at his menu in disgust. He didn't think much of it at all. "I don't know what I would like, Mr. Brown," he said. "My programme's full of mistakes, and I can't read it." "Mistakes?" The head waiter raised one eyebrow to its full height and looked at Paddington severely. "There is never a mistake on a Porchester menu." "Those aren't mistakes, Paddington," whispered Judy, as she looked over his shoulder. "It's French." "French?" exclaimed Paddington. "Fancy printing a menu in French." Mr. Brown hastily scanned his own card. "Have you anything suitable for a young bear's treat?" he asked. "A young bear's treat," repeated the head waiter haughtily. "We pride ourselves that there is nothing one cannot obtain at the Porchester." "In that case," said Paddington, looking most relieved, "I think I'll have a marmalade sandwich." Looking around, Paddington decided that a place as important as the Porchester must serve very good marmalade sandwiches, and he was anxious to test one. "I beg your pardon, sir," exclaimed the waiter. "Did you say a marmalade sandwich?" "Yes, please," said Paddington, "with custard." "For dinner?" said the man. "Yes," said Paddington firmly. "I'm very fond of marmalade, and you said there was nothing you don't have." The man swallowed hard. In all his years at the Porchester, he'd never been asked for a marmalade sandwich before, particularly by a bear. He beckoned to another waiter standing nearby. "A marmalade sandwich for the young bear, gentlemen," he said, "with custard." "A marmalade sandwich for the young bear, gentleman, with the custard," repeated the second waiter. He disappeared through a door leading to the kitchens, as if in a dream, and the Browns heard the order repeated several more times before it closed. "A marmalade sandwich for a young bear, gentleman, with the custard. Is a marmalade sandwich for a young bear, gentleman, with the custard." They looked around uneasily while they gave another waiter their own orders. There seemed to be some sort of commotion going on in the kitchen. Several times they heard raised voices, and once the door opened, and a man in a chef's hat appeared round the corner and stared in their direction. "Perhaps, sir," said yet another waiter, as he wheeled a huge trolley laden with dishes towards the table, "perhaps you would care for some hors d'oeuvres while you wait." "That's a sort of salad," Mr. Brown explained to Paddington. Paddington licked his whiskers. "It looks a very good bargain," he said, staring at all the dishes. "I think perhaps I will." "Oh, dear," said Mrs. Brown, as Paddington began helping himself. "You're not supposed to eat it from the trolley, Paddington." Paddington looked most disappointed as he watched the waiter serve the hors d'oeuvre. It wasn't really such good value as he'd thought. But by the time the man had finished piling his plate with vegetables and pickles and salad and a pile of interesting-looking little silver onions, he began to change his mind again. Perhaps, he decided, he couldn't have managed the whole trolleyful after all. While Mr. Brown gave the rest of the orders, soup for the others, followed by fish, and a special omelette for Mr. Gruber, Paddington sat back and prepared to enjoy himself. "Would you like anything to drink, Paddington?" asked Mr. Brown. "No, thank you, Mr. Brown," said Paddington. "I have a bowl of water." "I don't think that's drinking water, Mr. Brown," said Mr. Gruber tactfully. "That's to dip your paws in when they get sticky. That's what's known as a paw bowl." "A paw bowl?" exclaimed Paddington. "But I had a bath this afternoon." "Never mind," said Mr. Brown hastily. "I'll send for the lemonade waiter, and then you can have an orange squash or something." Paddington was getting more and more confused. It was all most complicated, and he'd never seen so many waiters before. He decided to concentrate on eating for a bit. "Most enjoyable," said Mr. Gruber a few minutes later when he'd finished his soup. "I shall look forward to my omelette now." He looked across the table at Paddington. "Are you enjoying your hors d'oeuvre, Mr. Brown?" "It's very nice, Mr. Gruber," said Paddington, staring down at his plate with a puzzled expression on his face. "But I think I've lost one of my onions." "You've what?" asked Mr. Brown. It was difficult to hear what Paddington was saying for the noise the orchestra was making. It had been playing quite sweetly up until a moment ago, but suddenly it had started making a dreadful row. It was something to do with one of the saxophone players in the front row. He kept shaking his instrument and then trying to blow it, and all the while the conductor was glaring at him. "My onion!" exclaimed Paddington. "I had 6 just now, and when I put my fork on one of them, it suddenly disappeared. Now I've only got 5. Mrs. Brown began to look more and more embarrassed as Paddington got down off his seat and began peering under the tables. "I do hope he finds it soon," she said. Everyone in the restaurant seemed to be looking in their direction, and if they weren't actually pointing, she knew they were talking about them. "Gosh!" exclaimed Jonathan suddenly. He pointed towards the orchestra. "There's Paddington's onion!" The Browns turned and looked at the orchestra. The saxophone player seemed to be having an argument with the conductor. "How can I be expected to play properly," he said bitterly, "when I've got an onion in my instrument, and I've a good idea where it came from, too?" The conductor followed his gaze towards the Browns, who hurriedly looked the other way. "For heaven's sake, don't tell Paddington," said Mrs. Brown. "He'll only want it back." "Never mind," said Mr. Gruber, as the door leading to the kitchen opened. "I think my omelette's just coming." The Browns watched as a waiter entered, bearing a silver dish, which he placed on a small spirit stove near their table. Mr. Gruber had ordered an omelette flambé, which meant it was set on fire just before it was served. "I don't know when I had one of those last," he said. "I'm looking forward to it." "I must say it looks very nice," said Mr. Brown, twirling his moustache thoughtfully. "I rather wish I'd ordered one myself now." "Come along, Paddington," he called, as the waiter set light to the pan. "Come and see Mr. Gruber's omelette. It's on fire." "What?" cried Paddington, poking his head out from beneath the table. "Mr. Gruber's omelette on fire?" He stared in astonishment at the waiter as he bore the silver tray with its flaming omelette towards the table. "It's all right, Mr. Gruber," he called, waving his paws in the air. "I'm coming." Before the Browns could stop him, Paddington had grabbed his paw bowl and had thrown the contents over the tray. There was a loud hissing noise, and before the astonished gaze of the waiter, Mr. Gruber's omelette slowly collapsed into a soggy mess in the bottom of the dish. Several people near the Browns applauded. "What an unusual idea," said one of them. "Having the cabaret act sit at one of the tables just like anyone else." One old gentleman in particular, who was sitting by himself at the next table, laughed no end. He'd been watching Paddington intently for some time, and now he began slapping his knee at each new happening. "Crikey," said John, "we're for it now." He pointed towards a party of very important-looking people, led by the head waiter, who were approaching the Browns' table. They stopped a few feet away, and the head waiter pointed at Paddington. "That's the one," he said. "The one with the whiskers." The most important-looking man stepped forward. "I'm the manager," he announced, "and I'm afraid I must ask you to leave," throwing water over a waiter, putting onions in a saxophone, ordering marmalade sandwiches. "You'll get the Porchester a bad name." Mr. and Mrs. Brown exchanged glances. "Well, I've never heard of such a thing," said Mrs. Bird. "If that bear goes, we all go." "Hear, hear," echoed Mr. Gruber. "Yeah, and if you go, I shall go too," came a voice from the next table. Everyone looked round as the old gentleman, who'd been watching the proceedings, rose and waved a finger at the manager. "May I ask why this young bear's being asked to leave?" he boomed. The manager began to look even more worried, for the old gentleman was one of his best customers, and he didn't want to offend him. "It annoys the other diners," he said. "Nonsense," boomed the old gentleman. "I'm one of the other diners, and I'm not annoyed. Best thing that's happened in years. Don't know when I've enjoyed myself so much." He looked down at Paddington. "I should like to shake you by the paw, Bear. It's about time this place was livened up a bit." "Thank you very much," said Paddington, holding out his paw. He was a bit overawed by the old gentleman, and he wasn't at all sure what it was all about anyway. The old gentleman waved the waiters and the manager to one side, and then turned to Mr. Brown. "I'd better introduce myself," he said.
I'm Sir Huntley Martin, the Marmalade King. Yeah, I've been in Marmalade for 50 years, he boomed. And I've been coming here for 30. Never heard anyone ask for a marmalade sandwich before. Does me old heart good.
Paddington looked most impressed. Fancy being in Marmalade for 50 years, he exclaimed.
I hope you'll allow me to join you, said Sir Huntley. I've done a good many things in my life, but I don't think I've ever been to a bear's birthday party before.
The old gentleman's presence seemed to have a magical effect on the manager of the Porchester, for he had a hurried conference with the head waiter, and in no time at all a procession started from the kitchen, headed by a waiter bearing a silver tray on which there was another omelette for Mr. Gruber. It was a hilarious party of Browns who finally got up to go. Paddington was so full of good things he had a job to get up at all. He had a last, lingering look at the remains of an ice cream on his plate, but decided that enough was as good as a feast. He'd enjoyed himself no end, and after a great deal of thought, he left a penny under his plate for the waiter. Sir Huntley Martin seemed very sad that it had all come to an end.
Most enjoyable, he kept booming as they left the table. Most enjoyable. Perhaps, he added hopefully to Paddington, perhaps you'll do me the honour of visiting my factory one of these days.
Oh, yes, please, said Paddington. I should like that very much.